The approach came through unconventional channels in late January 2025, just days after Trump's second inauguration. Scott Bessent, the newly confirmed Treasury Secretary, wasn't using State Department protocols or official diplomatic frameworks. Instead, the outreach came through private equity contacts and hedge fund networks, the world Bessent had dominated before joining Trump's cabinet. The message was direct. Bessent wanted to discuss investment opportunities in Burkina Faso's gold sector. Not as Treasury Secretary officially, but as someone with connections to capital that could flow if the right arrangements were made. It was the kind of public-private boundary blurring that characterized Trump's approach to governance, cabinet officials maintaining one foot in business networks while exercising government authority. Traoré's intelligence services flagged the approach immediately. Bessent wasn't just any Treasury Secretary. He was a billionaire hedge fund manager who'd made fortunes in currency speculation and commodity trades. His appointment to Treasury had raised concerns among financial regulation advocates because of potential conflicts between his personal investments and his official duties. And now he was reaching out about African gold through private channels while holding one of the most powerful economic positions in the U.S. government. The initial message, delivered through a South African mining executive with ties to both Bessent's former hedge fund and Burkina Faso's gold sector, was framed as exploratory. Secretary Bessent has significant interest in African mineral development. He believes Burkina Faso is undervaluing its gold potential due to lack of access to sophisticated financial instruments and global markets. He'd like to discuss how American capital and expertise could help maximize the value of Burkinabe gold reserves for mutual benefit. Traoré's response through the same channel was cautious. Burkina Faso is always interested in discussions about maximizing our resource value. But any such discussions must be conducted through official government channels with full transparency about who benefits from proposed arrangements. If Secretary Bessent wants to discuss Burkina Faso's gold sector, he should do so in his capacity as Treasury Secretary through diplomatic protocols, not through private intermediaries representing unclear interests. The message created a dilemma for Bessent. Conducting discussions through official channels would create a public record and require disclosures about potential conflicts of interest. But Traoré had made clear that informal back-channel approaches wouldn't be entertained. After 2 weeks of consideration, Bessent chose a hybrid approach. He would request an official meeting as Treasury Secretary to discuss U.S.-Burkina Faso economic cooperation, but the substantive discussion would focus on gold sector partnerships that could involve private American capital, including potentially from Bessent's network. The meeting was scheduled for early March 2025 in Washington. Traoré would be there for World Bank meetings and agreed to a bilateral session with the Treasury Secretary. The setting was Bessent's office at Treasury, an ornate room designed to impress with its historic furnishings and commanding view. Bessent opened with his characteristic smooth confidence, the manner of someone who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and knew how to read counterparties. Captain Traoré, thank you for making time. I've been studying Burkina Faso's gold sector closely. You're sitting on one of Africa's largest gold reserves, approximately 350 tons of proven reserves, possibly much more with proper geological surveys. But you're capturing maybe 30% of the potential value. The rest is lost to inefficient extraction, lack of refining capacity, and selling into markets where you have no pricing power. That's leaving billions on the table. Traoré listened carefully. Bessent was knowledgeable. The numbers were accurate, the analysis of value capture wasn't wrong. But he was curious where this would lead. Secretary Bessent, your analysis is correct. We are capturing less value than optimal. That's exactly why we've been renegotiating mining contracts, demanding higher royalties, requiring local processing, and diversifying our marketing channels. We're addressing the problem you've identified. You're addressing it, but not optimally. Because you're taking an adversarial approach. Forcing contract renegotiations, threatening foreign mining companies, creating regulatory uncertainty. That might get you from 30% value capture to 40%. But it also scares off sophisticated capital that could get you to 70 or 80% through better approaches. What approaches specifically? Bessent leaned forward, entering the pitch he'd prepared carefully. Here's what I'm proposing. A comprehensive partnership between Burkina Faso and a consortium of American financial institutions with deep expertise in commodity markets. We would provide, 1. Capital for modern extraction technology that increases yields, 2. Refining facilities in Burkina Faso so you're exporting refined gold not ore, much higher value, 3. Access to global commodity markets where we can secure premium prices through sophisticated hedging and futures contracts. 4. Financial structuring that maximizes Burkina Faso's revenue while managing currency and price risks. In exchange for what? In exchange for long-term contracts that give the consortium priority access to Burkina Faso's gold production at agreed prices, and revenue sharing that reflects the value we're adding through technology, refining, and market access. The specific terms would be negotiated, but the principle is: we provide capabilities you don't currently have, and we share in the increased value those capabilities generate. Traoré asked the obvious question, and what's your personal interest in this consortium, Secretary Bessent? Because you're describing private American financial institutions while sitting in your capacity as Treasury Secretary. Are you representing the U.S. government or private investors? Bessent had anticipated this and had his answer prepared. I'm representing American economic interests broadly, which includes both facilitating U.S. government support for partnerships that serve American strategic objectives, and connecting African nations with American private capital that can deliver real development. My role is to ensure those interests align. If Burkina Faso partners with American institutions I'm connected to, the U.S. government would view that favorably and provide supportive policy frameworks. If you partner with Chinese or Russian entities, that creates complications. I'm being transparent about that linkage. So to be clear, you're proposing that Burkina Faso enter into long-term contracts with American financial institutions, some of which you have personal connections to, for priority access to our gold. And if we do, the U.S. government provides favorable treatment. If we don't, there are complications. Is that accurate? That's one way to frame it. Another way is: I'm offering to help Burkina Faso access American capital and expertise that can genuinely increase your gold revenue while strengthening U.S.-Burkina Faso economic ties. The alternative is continuing to work with partners who don't have the same capabilities, which leaves money on the table and doesn't improve bilateral relations. Traoré paused before responding, choosing his words carefully. Secretary Bessent, let me make sure I understand the mathematics of what you're proposing. You say we're currently capturing 30% of potential gold value. You say your consortium could help us capture 70 or 80%. That sounds attractive until I ask, 70 or 80% of what, and who gets the other 20 or 30%? Because if your consortium is taking a share of the increased value as payment for services, the question is whether we end up with more total value or just more complexity with similar ultimate capture. Bessent smiled. Traoré was sharper than most African leaders he'd dealt with. Fair question. Let me be specific with a hypothetical. Under current arrangements, let's say Burkina Faso produces 100 tons of gold worth $6 billion at market prices. You capture 30% through royalties and taxes, $1.8 billion. Under the arrangement I'm proposing, better technology and processes might increase production to 120 tons worth $7.2 billion. Better refining and marketing might secure 10% premium prices, now $7.9 billion. And sophisticated financial management might capture another 5% through optimal timing and hedging, $8.3 billion total value. If Burkina Faso receives 60% of that under the partnership, $5 billion, you've nearly tripled your revenue from $1.8 billion to $5 billion. Yes, the consortium takes 40%, $3.3 billion. But you're getting far more than current arrangements deliver. Traoré did the math quickly. Your hypothetical assumes several things. First, that production increases by 20%, where's the evidence that's achievable with current reserves? Second, that premium prices are sustainable, commodity markets are volatile, premiums disappear quickly. Third, that financial management captures 5% additional value, that sounds like fees dressed up as value creation. And most critically, it assumes Burkina Faso couldn't achieve those improvements independently or with partners who take smaller shares. Why wouldn't we just hire the expertise, build the refining capacity ourselves, and keep 70 or 80% rather than giving 40% to your consortium? Because you don't have the capital to build that capacity independently. You don't have the expertise to manage it. And you don't have the market access to sell effectively. You could try to build it over 10 or 15 years, maybe. But in the meantime, you're leaving billions on the table every year. My consortium can deliver the improvements in 18 months. The question isn't whether you could theoretically do this yourself eventually. It's whether the money you'd forego waiting to do it yourself is worth more than the share you'd pay my consortium to do it now. Secretary Bessent, you keep referring to my consortium and I'm proposing. But you're Treasury Secretary. Are you speaking for the US government, or for private investors you're connected to, or for yourself personally? Because those are very different things with very different implications. Bessent's response was carefully constructed. I'm speaking as Treasury Secretary about economic partnerships that serve both U.S. interests and Burkinabe development. The specific consortium that would implement such a partnership would be private American financial institutions, some of which I have historical relationships with from my pre-government career. But I'm not personally invested in the transactions, that would violate conflict of interest rules. What I'm offering is to facilitate connections between Burkina Faso and sophisticated American capital that can deliver the outcomes I've described. Traoré pressed harder. When you say, facilitate connections, what does that mean specifically? Are you receiving fees or compensation from these institutions for making introductions? Are there revenue-sharing arrangements between you and the consortium? Or are your connections purely historical with no current financial interest? The question created visible discomfort. Bessent shifted slightly. My financial arrangements are disclosed as required by ethics rules. What I can tell you is that as Treasury Secretary, my compensation comes from the U.S. government. Any historical relationships with financial institutions are recused where appropriate under conflict of interest guidelines. What I'm offering Burkina Faso is access to American financial expertise through my official capacity as Treasury Secretary facilitating economic partnerships that serve U.S. policy objectives. That's not an answer to my question. But let me ask a different one. If Burkina Faso decided to pursue the improvements you've described, better extraction, local refining, sophisticated marketing, but did so through partnerships with Chinese financial institutions or European firms rather than your consortium, would that still receive U.S. government support? Or is the support conditional on working with American institutions you're connected to? Bessent's answer revealed the real framework: the U.S. government has strategic interest in American firms participating in African mineral development, particularly for strategic minerals like gold that have implications for currency markets and financial stability. If Burkina Faso partners primarily with Chinese institutions, that creates complications for U.S. support. If you partner with American institutions, we can provide not just capital but also diplomatic and policy support that makes the entire framework more favorable. That's not conditionality, that's alignment of interests. Secretary Bessent, that's absolutely conditionality. You're saying U.S. support is conditional on Burkina Faso choosing American partners, specifically partners you have connections to. Let me be direct about what I'm hearing. You want Burkina Faso to grant long-term contracts giving American financial institutions priority access to our gold, in exchange for which we get technology and market access that increase total value but leave us with smaller percentage of that value than we could negotiate with other partners. And if we choose other partners, we face U.S. government complications. Is that incorrect? You're framing it as exploitation when it's actually opportunity. I'm framing it as mathematics. You want 40% of increased value in exchange for improvements we could achieve ourselves or with partners who charge less. That might make sense if we had no alternatives. But we have Chinese institutions offering similar capabilities for 25% share. We have European firms at 30%. Your consortium wants 40% plus the political leverage of U.S. government support. That's not opportunity, that's worse terms wrapped in diplomatic pressure. Bessent recalibrated, sensing the pitch wasn't working. Captain Traoré, let's step back. You're clearly sophisticated about these arrangements. So let me ask you, what would make a partnership with American financial institutions attractive to Burkina Faso? Because I'm hearing that you want better terms. Fine. Terms are negotiable. But what's not negotiable from U.S. perspective is that we can't support Burkina Faso deepening economic dependence on Chinese or Russian institutions that use commodity access for geopolitical leverage. If you want U.S. partnership, it requires working with American firms. The question is what terms make that worthwhile for you. Secretary Bessent, you've just stated the problem clearly. From your perspective, Burkina Faso must work with American firms to receive U.S. support. But from our perspective, we must diversify partners to avoid dependence on any single country, including America. Those frameworks are incompatible. You can't simultaneously demand that we work primarily with American firms and claim to support our independence and sovereignty. So we have to choose: accept American primacy and U.S. government support, or maintain diversified partnerships and face U.S. opposition. We're choosing diversification. Which means we're prepared to face U.S. opposition. That's a false choice, it's the choice you've just outlined. You said U.S. support requires working with American firms. We're saying we won't subordinate our partnership decisions to any single country's preferences. Those positions are mutually exclusive. There's no middle ground where we choose American primacy and you call it diversification. The meeting was clearly not producing the outcome Bessent had wanted. But he made one final attempt. Captain Traoré, let me be very clear about what's at stake. Burkina Faso's gold sector could be worth tens of billions of dollars annually with proper development. That wealth could transform your nation. But accessing it requires partners with sophisticated capabilities. Those partners exist primarily in the US and Europe. China can provide capital but not the same financial engineering and market access. Russia can't provide either at scale. So practically, your choice is: work with Western institutions on terms that reflect the value they add, or forego the optimization and leave massive wealth untapped. I'm offering to help you access that wealth through American partnerships. The alternative is leaving it in the ground. Traoré's response was final: Secretary Bessent, you're offering to help us access our own wealth by giving American institutions 40% of it. That's not helping us access wealth. That's helping American institutions access our wealth while we provide the gold. We'll develop our gold sector at our own pace, with partners we choose based on who offers best terms for Burkina Faso. If those are American firms offering genuinely competitive arrangements, we'll work with them. If they're Chinese or European or Turkish firms, we'll work with them. What we won't do is grant American firms preferential access to our gold in exchange for U.S. government support. Because that's not economics, that's selling sovereignty for market access. And Burkina Faso's sovereignty isn't for sale. The meeting ended shortly after. No agreements. No framework for future cooperation. Just mutual understanding that Bessent wanted access to Burkina Faso's gold through American firms, and Traoré was unwilling to grant that access on terms that involved U.S. government pressure as leverage. 2 weeks after the Treasury meeting, Bessent tried a different approach. If official channels weren't working, perhaps market pressure would. Through allies in financial media, stories began appearing about Burkina Faso's gold sector being undervalued and underdeveloped due to political instability and poor governance. Bloomberg ran a piece citing anonymous treasury sources expressing concern about African gold reserves falling under Chinese control due to Western capital reluctance. The Financial Times published analysis suggesting Burkina Faso's contract renegotiations were scaring off sophisticated investors and condemning the nation to continued poverty despite mineral wealth. The message was coordinated: Burkina Faso needed Western financial institutions or its gold would remain economically stranded. Traoré recognized the campaign immediately. The timing, the consistent framing, the anonymous treasury sources. This was Bessent using media to create pressure that the face-to-face meeting hadn't achieved. His response was to do nothing publicly for 2 weeks. Then he gave a detailed interview to Reuters specifically about Burkina Faso's gold strategy. I've read recent coverage suggesting Burkina Faso's gold is undervalued because we've scared off Western investors. Let me provide context with numbers. Under contracts negotiated when we had no leverage, Burkina Faso received 8 to 12% royalties. International standard for resource-rich nations is 15 to 25%. We renegotiated to 15% minimum, still below many comparable nations, but better than before. Western mining companies called this regulatory uncertainty. But from our perspective, we corrected unfair arrangements. Companies that left did so because they preferred 8% royalties to 15%. Companies willing to pay fair market rates, including some American firms, some Chinese, some European, are operating successfully in Burkina Faso today. He continued, on the claim that our gold is economically stranded, without Western financial institutions, Burkina Faso produced approximately 45 tons of gold last year worth roughly $2.7 billion. We're building refining capacity to export refined gold rather than ore, capturing significantly more value. We're diversifying marketing channels to avoid dependence on any single buyer. And we're doing this with multiple international partners based on who offers best terms, not who applies most political pressure. If Western institutions want to participate, they can compete on commercial terms like everyone else. What they can't do is use U.S. government leverage to demand preferential access. The interview went viral in financial circles. Bessent's media campaign had intended to pressure Traoré into accepting American terms. Instead, it provided a platform for Traoré to explain why those terms were being rejected. 1 month after the Treasury meeting, Bessent escalated. Using his authority as Treasury Secretary, he announced new, transparency requirements for financial institutions doing business in the U.S. that also had exposure to high-risk African gold operations. The requirements were technically applicable to all African gold dealings, but definitions and reporting requirements were clearly designed to create compliance costs that would discourage Western institutions from operating in Burkina Faso. It was economic statecraft, using regulatory authority to make Burkina Faso's gold sector less attractive to potential partners, thereby increasing pressure to accept American consortium terms. European and Asian banks with Burkina Faso exposure complained about extraterritorial overreach and politically motivated regulations. But Bessent held firm, using Treasury's massive influence over global dollar transactions as leverage. Traoré's response was unexpected. Rather than protest the Treasury requirements, he announced that Burkina Faso would begin accepting payment for gold exports in currencies other than dollars. Chinese yuan, European euros, UAE dirhams, even Russian rubles for specific transactions. If U.S. Treasury is going to use dollar system as economic weapon to pressure our gold sector, we'll reduce our dependence on dollar-denominated transactions. We have buyers willing to pay in other currencies. This diversifies our economic relationships and reduces vulnerability to U.S. financial leverage. The announcement sent shockwaves through currency markets. Burkina Faso's gold exports weren't large enough to meaningfully impact dollar dominance globally. But the precedent of an African nation explicitly moving away from dollar transactions in response to U.S. pressure created concerns about whether other nations might follow. China's foreign ministry immediately praised the decision as reasonable response to American economic coercion. Russia offered technical support for ruble-denominated gold transactions. The narrative Bessent had tried to create, that Burkina Faso needed American financial institutions, was being replaced by a narrative that American financial pressure was driving nations toward dollar alternatives. 2 months after the Treasury meeting, Bessent requested a second meeting. The message suggested he was prepared to discuss more flexible arrangements. Traoré agreed, curious whether American position had genuinely shifted. The second meeting was smaller. Just Bessent, one aide, Traoré, and his economic minister. Bessent opened differently, Captain Traoré, our first meeting didn't go as I'd hoped. I came in with assumptions about what Burkina Faso needed that didn't match your actual situation. I've spent 2 months studying your gold sector reforms more carefully. And I want to acknowledge, you've achieved real improvements in revenue capture through the renegotiations. 15% royalties, local processing requirements, diversified marketing, those are legitimate gains. I appreciate that acknowledgement, Secretary Bessent. What's changed in your thinking? What's changed is recognizing that the consortium approach I proposed, 40% to American firms, isn't necessary to achieve U.S. policy objectives. Our objective is preventing Chinese financial institutions from gaining dominant position in African strategic minerals. That doesn't require American firms getting 40%. It just requires significant enough American presence that China doesn't have monopoly. So I want to propose something different. U.S. provides technical assistance and market access support for Burkina Faso's gold sector without requiring exclusive contracts. We help you build refining capacity. We facilitate access to commodity exchanges. We provide financial expertise through technical assistance. And in exchange, you commit that at least 30% of your gold sector partnerships involve Western firms, American or European, rather than exclusively Chinese or Russian partners. Traoré considered this carefully. It was significantly different from the first proposal. What would technical assistance mean specifically? Because technical assistance that comes with political conditions isn't really assistance, it's leverage with different branding. I'm proposing that U.S. Treasury, through development finance institutions, provides geological survey support, engineering expertise for refining facilities, training for Burkinabe financial managers on commodity markets, and facilitated introductions to global gold buyers. This would be U.S. government assistance, not commercial transactions requiring revenue sharing. The only condition is the 30% Western partnership commitment. And if we don't maintain 30% Western partnerships? If we find Chinese or Turkish firms offer better terms across the board and Western presence falls below 30%? Then we'd reconsider whether continued U.S. assistance serves American interests. But the commitment gives you flexibility. You can have 40% Chinese, 30% Western, 30% others. As long as Western firms collectively maintain significant presence that no single non-Western country dominates. Traoré saw the logic but also the limitation. Secretary Bessent, you're proposing that U.S. assistance is conditional on Western firms maintaining 30%. That's still conditionality. Less demanding than your original proposal, but it still requires us to make partnership decisions based on U.S. preferences rather than purely commercial terms. What if Turkish firms offer the best terms across the board? Would we have to reject better terms from non-Western partners to maintain 30% Western threshold? You'd have to balance commercial optimization against relationship with the United States. Which every country does, balancing economic decisions against geopolitical relationships. I'm not asking for exclusive access or preferential terms. Just that Western firms maintain significant presence so you're not economically dependent on China or Russia. It's more reasonable than your first proposal. But it's still asking Burkina Faso to subordinate commercial decision-making to U.S. geopolitical preferences. We make partnership decisions based on who offers best commercial terms, full stop. If that results in 60% Chinese partnerships because Chinese firms offer better terms, that's commercial outcome, not political alignment. Imposing 30% Western floor means we'd accept worse commercial terms from Western firms to maintain U.S. assistance. That's economics subordinated to politics. The second meeting ended without agreement. Bessent had shifted from demanding American consortium access to requesting Western partnership floors. Traoré had remained firm that partnership decisions would be made on commercial terms without geopolitical conditions. The gap had narrowed but not closed. 4 months later, in September 2025, Burkina Faso announced a major gold discovery. Geological surveys identified reserves potentially triple previous estimates. If confirmed, Burkina Faso would move from significant regional producer to one of Africa's largest. The discovery changed the mathematics of every negotiation. Access to Burkina Faso's gold was even more valuable. And Burkina Faso's leverage increased proportionally. Within a week, Bessent was back in contact requesting urgent discussions. But Traoré declined. Secretary Bessent, when we had smaller proven reserves, you wanted 40% for American consortium. When I rejected that, you wanted 30% Western partnership floor. Now that reserves are potentially much larger, I imagine you'll want to revisit terms. But from Burkina Faso's perspective, larger reserves mean we have more leverage, not less. We don't need to negotiate access terms with U.S. Treasury. We have dozens of firms, American, Chinese, European, others, competing to partner with us on our terms. So respectfully, we don't need another meeting where you outline U.S. requirements. We'll proceed with commercial partnerships based on commercial terms. Bessent tried one more approach through a public speech at the Peterson Institute in Washington. He outlined a new, African Minerals Partnership Initiative that would provide U.S. technical and financial support for African nations developing strategic mineral resources. The initiative included geological surveys, refining capacity support, market access facilitation. But it also included the condition he'd sought. Recipient nations would commit to maintaining diversified partnerships including significant Western presence in strategic mineral sectors. It was an attempt to create a broader framework that included Burkina Faso's requirements without singling them out. Traoré's response came in an interview 2 weeks later. I've read about Secretary Bessent's African Minerals Partnership Initiative. It offers technical assistance conditional on African nations maintaining Western partnership floors in mineral sectors. That's assistance designed to purchase commercial outcomes. Real partnership would offer assistance based on development impact, not on who African nations choose as commercial partners. If U.S. wants to help African mineral development, help without strings. Provide geological expertise. Share refining technology. Facilitate market access. But don't condition that help on African nations giving Western firms guaranteed market share. That's not partnership, that's using assistance as leverage for commercial advantage. 1 year after the initial Treasury meeting, when asked about Bessent's approaches, Traoré was characteristically direct. Secretary Bessent saw Burkina Faso's gold and wanted to ensure American firms had access. He tried multiple frameworks. Direct consortium partnership taking 40%, Western presence floors of 30%, conditional assistance requiring diversified partnerships. Each framework was designed to give American or Western firms access regardless of whether they offered best commercial terms. We rejected each framework for the same reason. Burkina Faso's gold sector operates on commercial competition. Firms offering best terms get contracts, American, Chinese, European, Turkish, doesn't matter. No preferential access based on political relationships. Bessent wanted to use U.S. government position to secure commercial advantage for American firms. We refused. The vault stayed locked to anyone demanding keys based on political leverage rather than commercial merit.